Introduce Gareth and Jack. So some of you may remember between 2010 and 2020, Gareth was a Green Party MP, and since then he's done various things, but particularly living on an island in the Otago Harbour and writing a book, The Gentle Radical, which was the biography of Jeanette Fitzsimons. I don't know if you've read that. Great book, and just really enlightening about how somebody can be so passionate and so driven to care for the environment and basically give their life for it. Gareth's now the country lead for the Wellbeing Economy Alliance of Aotearoa New Zealand. It's a worldwide organisation, and he's working with hub members, officials, community groups, businesses to grow a wellbeing economy. So we're going to find out what a wellbeing economy is. Gareth's also a political commentator on RNZ and a writer on Stuff, and moved from the island to make it slightly easier for his life with children, and living with his wife in Wellington now, and doing a wellbeing tour, the start of a nationwide tour in his electric camper van, staying in Māpua as first stop. So we get in the news first. And Jack is Jack Santa Barbara, lives in Atamai Village with Joanna. Some of you will be aware of Joanna's work with Climate Forum. He's a retired CEO and academic, and has been an environmental and peace activist for many decades, not being any aspersion on your age, Jack. He also is a writer for Newsroom and a member of the Wellbeing Economy Alliance Aotearoa. And like I said, lives in Atamai in an off-grid house. So I'd like you to give a really warm welcome to Jack and Gareth. Gareth will talk first, but yeah, thank you so much.
Should have brought some copies of the book. Well, kia ora, na mihi nui kia koutou kia ora. E whānau mai o te taha o te awa Tairāwhiti Gisborne, ki uri aho no Wales, Scotland, ki te noho o ke Pōneke Wellington. So I'm from Gisborne, my parents come from Wales and Scotland, I live in Wellington now. It was quite awesome. We sailed our yacht up from Otago. We made it safely, only put one distress call in on the voyage up, but it's really wonderful to be here, especially alongside someone I greatly admire and respect, Jack Santa Barbara, and this amazing forum. Like, how many communities across Aotearoa have these great monthly talks happening like this? So it's a real privilege to be invited to join you here tonight. On a personal note, as someone who works on economics full-time now, I can't believe so many people have come out to talk about economics publicly. Normally it puts people to sleep, so it's inspiring to see you all here. Kia ora koutou. And see if that works. So I wanted to start by framing tonight, because that's right, I'm literally driving around Aotearoa now on what we're calling an economics listening tour. Originally what I was going to do is that old politician thing, right? Which is that you go around the country and you talk at people. Then I got some advice from Gareth, why don't you flip it on its head? Why don't you go talk to ordinary people, what they think about the economy? So the whole point of this economics listening tour is we're calling it, the economy's too important to leave to just the economists. So what I'm trying to do is actually recapture some of that sense of ownership and agency, because, and this is why I've got my favourite economist up on the screen here, Hung Jun Chang from Cambridge University. Now I know economics is normally full of graphs and gigantic textbooks and lots of figures. I wanted to share with you tonight the world's smallest economics textbook. And I'll read it to you because it's only got 5 points to it. 1. 95% of economics is common sense. 2. Economics is not a science. 3. Economics is politics. 4. Never trust an economist. Hopefully there's no economists in the room tonight. And 5. Economics is too important to be left to the experts. So I want us all to recapture some of that sense of ownership and agency of the economy. Now, when I sort of reflect on my life growing up in Gisborne, even though I wasn't paying attention to the economy, it was something very much paying attention to me, my whānau, and my community. So I remember my dad used to work at the freezing works, and I remember the day where I think 900 men got laid off during the big economic reforms of the late 1980s. I still remember that night when Ruth Richardson announced the mother of all budgets, and my mum, who had been on the benefit for 2 decades, had her benefit slashed by a quarter. So even though we won't care about economics, it was happening to us, it was happening to our community. So that's sort of where I come into it. And look, I've spent my entire life since leaving Gisborne, as I call it, a professional do-gooder. I've tried literally every tactic under the sun. I've tried gigantic petitions, I've led inquiries, I've taken the government to court, and I've succeeded in one with judicial reviews. I've led 6,000 people marching up Queen Street for climate change. I've got myself arrested, yes, that is me, and got myself elected. And there, I tried all the tactics at my disposal. I negotiated with ministers and prime ministers. I passed laws, I passed amendments. I chaired a select committee, I led inquiries. So this entire time, sometimes you win and you make a change or you pass a law, and other times you don't. And what I sort of reflected at the end of my parliamentary career when I moved down to this conservation island, Aotearoa, called Quarantine Island, not Quarantine Station, which seemed like the best place to be in a global pandemic. That my entire life I've been focused on fighting all these good causes and trying all these tactics, and there I thought, well, maybe I just need to get busy and do more practical things. So I got really involved in grassroots conservation actions. I supported the New National Food Rescue Alliance, which saw 53 million meals given to hungry people over COVID over the last 2 years. And then I sort of reflected, after writing a book about Jeanette Fitzsimons on the island, my entire life I've been fighting very diligently the symptoms. I've been focused entirely on the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff, arguing what type of ambulance and what colour it's going to be. I realised, taking some inspiration from Jeanette Fitzsimons, we've got to think systemically. We've got to ask, why is there a cliff there in the first place? Why are these cars falling down it? What are the economic drivers that are causing it? So that's why, re-inspired to get back active and keep being a professional do-gooder, I was able to join this amazing global organisation called the Wellbeing Economy Alliance. So about 4 years ago, some amazing global thought leaders from Kate Raworth of Donut Economics, Jason Hickel, a wonderful degrowth proponent, Bob Costanza, a number of notable individuals around the world got together and realised everyone was doing really good work, but no one was actively working to connect all this good work. No one was amplifying it globally. So that's where the Alliance has been formed, and that's our maki today, is to amplify all this good thinking that's happening around the world. We've got hubs in 15 countries, and we've got a wonderful team in New Zealand, including Jack and others. What really attracted me to this idea that we need to focus systemically on the economy was the theory of change of the Wellbeing Economy Alliance. Now what we need to have is new knowledge, new case studies, new policies, new narratives, changing the way we think about things, our hearts and our minds, and connections, connecting all organisations and individuals. Sort of the way I liken it, right, is when I think back to the 80s and those big reforms that affected my families, it was kind of like, installing an operating system on your phone. You had like an Android phone or an iOS phone. That allows what programs can run and what programs can't run on your phone. It allows what's possible. So in the 80s, we installed this entirely new operating system that allowed some things to run and allowed other things to not run. And now we're sort of living with the consequences of that economic system we installed in the 80s, early 90s. And we're paying the costs, and I'll describe that in a little bit, but also look about where this new economic operating system we could install is. And this is, I think, the greatest challenge we have in 2023. So very quickly about the organisation, I describe We All Aotearoa as a bit like a think tank and a bit like a do tank. So we've collaborated globally on a global policy design guide. We were then one of 4 countries to actively trial it, which was trialled in Porirua and the Hut in Wellington with Wesley Community Action. And we then took those learnings and shared it globally, improving global policy design practices. We organise events, we're organising a conference, a whole bunch of different things. But really what I want to talk to you tonight was about donut economics. So I thought, we're talking about donuts, so let's maybe look at economics through the lens of food. So to start with, as part of my whakawhanaungatanga, or where my whānau came from, my story in Aotearoa started with a pavlova. So my family comes from Wales. It's a poor sort of mining village in the north. The cemetery is full of Hugheses, there's a pub and a church, and that's it. Really economically depressed. When you think of the differences between the UK and New Zealand in the early 20th century, New Zealanders were considerably taller on average. We were much healthier than what's happening over there. So my family was sort of desperate to find prosperity and opportunity, and they were looking at New Zealand and some of the people who had left there. But at that point, post the Second World War, the doors had shut to New Zealand. It was quite difficult to immigrate at that point. But luckily, my grandmother, who'd been a baker at the pub, had baked a pavlova for the Queen Mother, and that was sort of the ticket that my family used to get a ticket directly to New Zealand. Now, I don't know if it's true. It's like this, we've all got these family myths, but our sort of family myth is we're only in New Zealand because of a pavlova. So they moved from Wales to Tarapuri in Gisborne, and that's the story of the economy. For the last 150 years has been chasing growth. Now, Jack's going to talk a lot more about this in detail. Here's a graph of gross domestic product or economic growth over time. They were coming to find a sort of more future for their children. But now, after more than 160 years, we find ourselves, yes, the economy's never been healthier, and the drugs needed to cope with it have never been more affordable. We're finding that despite all this economic growth, we're not happier. Credit card bills are bigger, our houses are bigger, but actually in New Zealand we've got the highest rate of teen youth suicide in the entire developed world. We've got some of the worst stats for mental health, despite all this economic growth. We find it's not really solving the problems that we want it to. We find that we, like Donald Trump and all his food, we're chasing it as the primary goal of the economy, to strive for economic growth. So it means we'll get it from anywhere. And it's kind of like, I wish for a personal diet if I could just eat hot chips all day long. That's sort of my weakness food. If I was just looking at the raw calories coming in, that would be wonderful. But diets don't work like that, and economies don't work like that. Yet instead we chase growth wherever we can find it. We know that the cyclone on the east coast of New Zealand will increase GDP. The old famous example of a car accident increases GDP. So what we actually find ourselves in the position is that we're trying to find it from anywhere. And I think that's partly why we'll try and get economic growth from any source. We see it from our sort of unproductive housing sector, where people think that the pathway to prosperity is just to flip off houses. We can see some of the ways we treat RSE workers in New Zealand. We'll do anything to get economic growth. The fact that workers are sort of on these zero-time hour contracts. We also find that despite all that economic growth we've seen, the fruits of that economic growth aren't being shared fairly. This is a wonderful graphic from Toby Morris from the New Zealand Household Economics Survey, which split the assets of New Zealand, the wealth, so the assets minus the liabilities, into 10 plates at a table for 10 diners. If you split up the wealth of New Zealand in 2021-22, what you find is one person has 5 plates of food, 4 people get to share 1 plate each, and the other 5 have to share a single plate between them. And we actually know that the wealth inequality in New Zealand is considerably worse. We saw the fastest growth of inequality of any OECD country from that last economic operating system that was installed in the 80s. Even the OECD, not a leading liberal progressive economics, said that that's actually slowed down economic growth in New Zealand. Inequality is actually making us poorer, let alone the social harms that are causing it. And of course we saw that amazing new IRD tax report that showed that the 311 wealthiest families had an average of $276 million in assets. Previously the surveys topped out at 20 million. And in fact they're actually paying a lower effective marginal tax rate than average workers in New Zealand. So we've seen all this growth, but it's not being shared widely. We also see that this growth is leaving a sour taste in our mouths. We aren't happy, we're less fit, we're less connected as a society. We're seeing all these perverse social outcomes from homelessness to other areas. So to keep that sort of food analogy going, it's kind of like we're binging on all this low quality, fatty, sugary, alcoholic beverages. And it might feel good in the short term, but the next morning we're waking up with a little bit of a hangover. And this is what we're finding with our economy, is that we're spending so much time and money trying to tackle problems that the economy caused in the first place. Something that I saw up close witnessing numerous budgets in Parliament. I mean, we're spending in the last budget $1.7 billion on housing subsidies, mostly going to landlords, because we aren't having a fair housing market. We see $2.4 billion going and working for families, because people are working more than 40 hours a week and still not able to be able to provide for their families. You know, we see $300 million going for short-term motel accommodation for homelessness. And a stat that blew me out of the was staggered when I heard it recently is we're budgeting in New Zealand's budget up to $23 billion over the next 6 years to purchase offshore carbon credits. So rather than reducing our emissions domestically, we're going to spend potentially up to $23 billion paying other people to do it for us. What this is called in the literature, and we published a report about this globally, is failure demand. When you're spending vast sums of money to try and, well, not fix, but ameliorate problems that were entirely avoidable in the first place. Probably the most tangible example that comes to my mind is Wairoa, a small town of 4,500 people just south of Gisborne. There, they haven't had a primary health dental provider for many years. So what happens now? The DHB once every year sends a dentist up in a van, and the dentist recently went up there and pulled 300 teeth. You know, massively painful. Imagine the pain and the hurt that that's caused, but how ridiculously, from an economic perspective, that rather than fix the problem in the first place, we'd rather see all this harm come through. I recently learned in the United States, 5 million people there are directly employed as guards. They're literally guards outside stores or in jails or other places. Literally a gigantic chunk of that population is employed to protect themselves from the citizens of their own country. A huge waste of resources and not socially satisfying. So these are some of the problems from chasing all this growth. When I think about Jennifer Simons and the values party and that first generation researching that book, none of these ideas are new. These ideas have been debated for many years. We've seen some amazing New Zealand contributions like Marilyn Waring and feminist economics. We've seen donut economics, which I'll focus on a little bit in particular. My colleague, Professor Paul Dalziel, who actually wrote the book Wellbeing Economics in New Zealand, Earth for All, an amazing book that has just come out this year, which was again produced by the Club of Rome on the 50th anniversary of Limits to Growth. But I wonder if actually the book we should be referring to keep that food theme going is the Magic Porridge Pot. Now you probably remember the story, right? A household living in poverty just wishes if they could have a pot which would produce more porridge. And of course they got their wish, and the pot started growing porridge, and it grew out of the pot, then it took up the kitchen, then it grew into the entire house, and then it swallowed the entire village. And this is what we've kind of done with our economy. We've created this machine which grows on infinite growth, and we'll get it from any source, and we won't share it fairly, despite all the cost it's causing, and it's swallowing the world. And I know Mike Joy spoke recently, and he gave you all the stats you need to know to make you feel depressed about the state of the world and the environment, so I won't do that. But this is where we are. This economy is literally like the magic porridge pot, swallowed the world. Jack's going to talk a lot more about degrowth, which is one of the ideas encompassing a wellbeing economy. But a thought experiment I came across recently, which I thought is a great way of illustrating it. So imagine ancient Egypt. If you went back to the first king, or first pharaoh, was a guy called Nama, imagine this first king had a chest of gold that was a cubic square metre of gold. Imagine Egypt, across the 3,000 years of that civilization, grew at the rate New Zealand's aspired to for the last 50, 70 years of 4%. How big would that chest of gold be at the end of Queen Cleopatra's reign 3,000 years later? So Jeremy Grantham was an investment banker, sorry, it was a mathematician who was presenting this to a room full of investment bankers. And of course, they had all sorts of wild examples, Is it as big as the Earth? Is it as big as the Sun? In fact, the answer is, if you had that chest of gold growing 4% over 3,000 years, there's 1,580 octillion suns. I had to Google what an octillion was. It's 1,580 with 28 zeros after it. That's larger than the size of the universe. Patently impossible. And then lastly, this is the last food type thing, Salt Bay. We find now that we're entirely addicted to growth. We've structured our society in such a fashion that when growth falters, and we might see a recession, or at least a technical recession sometime this year, we see the huge pain that it's causing. The Reserve Bank, in fact, is engendering a recession at the moment with potentially 70,000 unemployed to try and keep inflation under control at huge harm, at huge cost to individuals and their families. So we're sort of on this treadmill, and when we hop off it or when we falter, it's coming at huge costs. So the mission of successive governments, and researching the book about Jeanette Fitzsimons, the original Values Party activists in the early 70s, used to call both Labour and National parties the concrete parties. Because sure, they disagreed on a few issues, but they both agreed the primary purpose of politics was to pour more concrete and have more hydro stations and more economic development. For decades, our goal in society has been to grow the pie, and the debate has been on the margins, how do we share the pie? Actually, in 2023, we need to totally rethink the pie. Why are we growing this pie? How big should it be? What should it be made of? How are we going to share this? And what gives me hope that we can actually question the fundamental systemic underpinnings of the way we operate our society is that we've fundamentally changed it in the past. When you think of post-colonial history in New Zealand, we've had 3 gigantic transformational changes. In the 1890s, with the second first wealthy state, the first state houses, universal suffrage in the 1890s, the 1930s welfare revolution, the fourth Labour government's dismantling of that in the 1980s with the neo-rural revolution. And what you can see is these operate on sort of 40, 50-year cycles. So I wonder what this next operating system for New Zealand and other countries is going to be. Where the Wellbeing Alliance fits in is we believe it's got to be designed around the challenges of our age. It's got to ask, what's the purpose? Is the role of the economy and businesses just to grow and make more money? Or is it to actually deliver social value? Is it to prevent problems happening in the first place? So I think of things like the just transitions, moving away from oil drilling, preventing that harm. Things like the circular economy, where we're not producing waste, we're incorporating waste streams into it. Where we're pre-distributing, where we're not waiting until the end of the system, and so much of the budget is taken up with wealth transfers, as I sort of talked about earlier. Why don't we ask the economy to do some of the heavy lifting and make sure that people are paid a livable wage at the moment? And you can see that with new ownership structures where cooperatives are running in the interests of their workers. In Italy, there's a law where a business winds up, the employees are given the first option to buy back the business and run it as a cooperative. We see companies offering 4-day work weeks like Perpetual Guardian in New Zealand. And lastly, it's an economy that's people-powered, where people actually have a say in the operation of their business or their society. And what we've seen in New Zealand is our first experiment with citizens' assemblies, where people are actively paid to participate in a program. Now, this is very much the wisdom of crowds, where we reach better decisions. But in Auckland, Watercare ran a citizens' assembly where citizens were actively paid, given access to experts, and Koitu, the Centre for Informed Futures at Auckland University, was involved there. So how do we redesign our economic systems so that people matter and people are given a say? And I could rattle off countless other examples of where this is happening overseas. We see cosmetic companies like Faith and Nature, which has now established a board position on their board, someone to represent nature, to make sure that that voice is represented around the table. You can look to Sweden, where they now have tax breaks, where people, if they want to fix a device or an appliance, are actually encouraged rather than just going out and replacing it in the first place. So these examples of wellbeing economy can be seen everywhere. Very quickly, because I know I've gone over time, but this is the traditional way we've thought about the economy. This has been described as the most dangerous image in the world. This is what underpinned much of economic and sustainable development over many decades. This idea that the economy was the same importance as the environment. Now, of course, what we know today is you can't have an economy if you don't have a safe environment. But this has been a challenge. There was an economist, Ted Nordhaus, who literally won the Nobel Prize for Economics, who argued that climate change didn't matter to the economy because most economic activity happened indoors. Therefore, you can have air conditioning. Therefore, there's not going to be any economic cost. I mean, bonkers stuff. So what we're seeing is a revolution in economics, and we've got dozens of economists involved in our organisation globally. Here, the economy is a subsidiary of the global ecosystem. So we've got ecological environmentalists. We've got the donut economic concept from Kate Raworth, which is we need to find ourselves in that sustainable middle of the donut. Outside is our environmental boundaries, and inside are the social boundaries, the cost to society. Here's a graphic that Kate Raworth was recently on a Treasury webinar, where you can see how New Zealand compares with Malawi, China, Denmark and Aotearoa. Massive environmental externalities. We're living outside of the sustainable range that we can live in. In New Zealand, the Doughnuts also been reimagined from a Māori tūhui perspective by Taina Bossa-Dean, where the actual donut has been flipped and that spiritual conception's been added, which I think is wonderful. We can see the sparklings of this happening inside the civil service. This is the living standards framework, which is now guiding the wellbeing budgets. At the top, you can see our individual wealth. In the middle, our institutional and collective, and bottom is our actual wealth, be it our natural capital, our environment, our financial capital. And I know this might look a bit complicated or abstract, but it is changing policy making in New Zealand. There are traditionally budget bids go through a benefit cost ratio which only looks at strictly financial matters. I can now go to Purirua in Wellington, where a housing regeneration project would have failed totally on a strict financial measurement. But when you looked at the benefits to well-being individually, collectively to that society, the whole economics changed and that project went ahead. We see changing models such as Hiara Waiora, which the Productivity Commission is recommending the government builds in as a fundamental underpinning for how government could operate. And I think it's wonderful, right? When you think of that operating system we installed in the 80s, many of the principles were about short-term thinking. They were principles of individualisation, profit maximisation at almost all cost. I wonder if we thought about things like katiakitanga, protecting whanaungatanga. These concepts, I think, would be richer for us. And this is, I think, one of the best articulations I've seen in Aotearoa from Dr. Jason Mika from Waikato University. Imagine this, an approach to business where managers are kaitiaki stewards who manage taonga treasures, not people, whose success is measured in mana, not of your own, but of how much of someone else's you uplift. In this view, wealth is not measured by how much you accumulate, by how much you give. And the definition of triple bottom line performance is moulding or well-being. I think it's a wonderful illustration. We're going to be highlighting all these different new schools of economic system design at a conference in Auckland in AUT in August. We're going to be highlighting multi-economic ideas, donut economics, degrowth economics, ecological economics. We can see the economy is changing all around us. And I find that really inspiring that we could be seeing one of these big new system design change opportunities. So thank you very much for the opportunity of listening to me tonight. This is, I think, the most important issue. If you care about people and poverty and homelessness, if you care about species extinction and climate change, if we don't get our economic signals right and systems right, we're just going to be focused on the symptoms. Kia ora koutou.
Thank you very much, Gareth. So I'm sure there's plenty of questions in your heads from that, so just hold on to those. We've got to hit Jack now, and then we'll get into getting some feedback from you all. Jack.
I'd like you to close your eyes just for a couple of minutes and think about things that have happened in your life that have given you deep satisfaction, a deep sense of well-being. Play that little mental game with themselves. Thank you. Hang on to that thought and that feeling, because we're going to come back to it later in the presentation. I want to talk to you about the degrowth movement. It has some very old historical antecedents, but its modern version is about 20 years old. It started primarily in Europe. It's a very broad movement. Gareth talked about the well-being movement being very broad. The degrowth movement is the same, and well-being movement encompasses it, so you can imagine how big a well-being movement is. It's so big and it's so complex, and there's so many different components of it, that there's actually contradictions within it. So I'm going to give you a particular version of the degrowth movement this evening. Okay? And I think it's important to understand some of the basic concepts, which I'm going to try to articulate for you, so that you can sort of steer your way through that literature if you decide to get involved with it. Because I want to just give you a brief overview of what I want to cover. The first thing I want to cover is the empirical evidence for the need for degrowth. The science. I'm not going to talk about capitalism or socialism, but about the science, number one. Secondly, I want to talk about the goals, the major goals. Despite the great breadth of the degrowth movement, there's some common goals that I think are quite central and critical. Just that having goals based on the science and necessity doesn't mean they're politically feasible. So we need to talk a little bit about what is in fact politically feasible. And naturally, there's always going to be a gap between what's politically feasible and what is needed. So there's room outside of the political system for citizen activism. So just to talk about that a bit. And then finally, given that breadth and richness and so many things to do and such a big task to do, and all the uncertainties involved, the issue becomes, what's the priority? Where do we start? So I'd like to address that as well. So much for technology. Okay, let's look at some of the, each of the items I'd like to cover. The empirical evidence about why we need degrowth. One of the issues that I think is often missed when we talk about environmental issues and even climate change is a real sense of the magnitude of change that's required. And if there's one thing that you take away from tonight is the importance of thinking about and trying to understand the absolute magnitude of change that's required. Okay? And that's got to be science-based. Major goals. Just going to identify 3 key ones that I think are common to most degrowth scholars and advocates. We'll talk a little bit about what's politically feasible, what is needed to be done outside of the political system in terms of activism, and some priority activities and projects. Start with major goals. First one. Okay, this is really central and where a lot of the science comes in. Degrowth is about a managed reduction of material throughput to carrying capacity. One of the slides that Gareth had put up about the way the economy should be represented was with inputs into the economy, activity within the economy, and then outputs into a waste stream. Right? That's what throughput's about. Right? So it connects the environment both from as a source, using environmental resources in some kind of economic activity and process, and then spewing it out as waste. That's what throughput is. It's a really important concept and one that isn't very common, so I encourage you to think about it a bit. The idea is to manage the level of throughput in the economy, what we take from nature, stick back in nature, and to bring it to a level where it's sustainable. Because right now we're about double where we need to be anywhere near sustainability. That is a huge magnitude of change that's required. So degrowth is essentially about the reduction, the managed reduction of throughput, of what goes through the economy. It's not necessarily about reducing economic activity or GDP. That's very likely to happen if you reduce throughput. But the goal is to reduce the throughput because that's what sustainability is about. Right? So that's goal number 1 of the degrowth movement. Clearly this is going to be disruptive. There are, as Gareth has pointed out, our entire economy and society is geared toward continuous economic growth. All our institutions are designed to encourage and support growth. So changing that, reversing that, is going to be disruptive. There's no way we can avoid disruption. It's just going to be less disruptive than if we keep going. That's the important thing to remember. So given that we can anticipate this disruption, key issue is how do we provide the supports necessary for people, for everyone, the justice issue that Gareth mentioned. How do we ensure that the supports are in place so that people can accept and support the kind of degrowth and material throughput that's required. Okay? Without the supports, we haven't a chance of doing that. So the supports are essential. And that justice issue with existing population and intergenerational justice is a major theme within the degrowth scholarship. But in order to not only make the change, but keep the change, we have to make systemic changes in many of our institutions, because they're all, if the existing ones are all going to push us back toward the growth paradigm that we have to resist. So in order to do that, we need systemic changes to support that transition to what's called the steady state economy. The steady state economy may sound uninteresting, but it's steady in terms of the level of material throughput, but it doesn't have to be stable or steady in terms of the qualitative improvements that can still occur. And that's an important distinction to keep in mind. Okay, material throughput. Let's talk a little bit about the magnitude here. First of all, we have to appreciate that we live on the only biosphere we know of in the universe. It's a very unique planet we happen to live on. And that biosphere is an incredibly complicated set of systems within systems within systems, all of which co-evolved over millions of years and have provided abundance for us. Right? So it's there and available. But we are now interfering with those global Earth systems, and the scope is global. You know, civilizations used to overuse resources in a particular area, they would just move on to another area. That was fine. Well, we don't have too many more areas. We're disrupting the entire Earth systems. So the scope is critical to important. Secondly, is the scale. It's really huge. It's at least 50% reduction overall in material throughput. And in some cases, like fossil fuels, it's 100% reduction that's needed over a very, very short period of time. So both the scope and the scale we need to keep in mind if we're assessing any program for dealing with climate change or biodiversity or any environmental problem. If we don't consider the scope, scale, and the speed of disruption that we're currently doing, we're unlikely to come up with adequate solutions. If we don't understand the magnitude, for example, if there's a traffic accident, the number of ambulances that get sent depend on the number of people injured. You know? If there's a fire, the number of fire engines that go out depend on how big the fire is. So if you don't know what the magnitude of the problem is, you're not going to give an adequate response. So understanding the scope, scale, and speed of disruption is really critical. Unfortunately, the speed of disruption and the scope and scale is such that we are at increasing risk of changing some of the ecological tipping points that comprise the biosphere. And there's dozens and hundreds of these potential tipping points. It's not an on-off switch, it either works or it doesn't. There's many subsystems within subsystems and so on. Coral reef, collapsing, which are major nurseries for major fisheries. If we lose the coral reef, we're going to lose a lot of fisheries, as well as a lot of beauty. So the risk of moving quickly toward irreversible tipping points mean we have to act fairly quickly. And some of the data that Gareth put up about planetary boundaries, some of the latest data is indicating we only have a decade or two at most to avoid. And if one of these Earth systems goes into an irreversible state change, that increases the likelihood that that's going to happen in other systems because they're all interrelated. So the risk is really high. We don't have a lot of time. And unfortunately, what's called green growth, usually in respect to climate change, and it's usually about just electrifying everything and continuing as we are, is just not up to the job. We can go into those details, but I just want to make that point. Okay, given the challenge, which is enormous, what is actually politically feasible? Well, providing supports for people is something that hopefully there could be some broad political support for. Things like universal basic income, universal basic services, that goes beyond just income in terms of education, food, housing, reduced work time. If we're going to produce less, we shouldn't have to work as long to do the production. And guaranteed work, so that everyone has a guaranteed income. It's the security that I talked about earlier. We also have to think about the systemic changes that are needed. So if we can make some progress, we don't snap back into the growth paradigm. Again, Gareth mentioned citizens' assemblies. And if you're not familiar with these processes, I encourage you to Google it, because it's an incredibly powerful way of reaching consensus on difficult, emotion-laden issues. And there's literally hundreds of these going on around the world currently, dealing with climate change, abortion, voting systems, water planning for large municipalities. It's a very, very powerful and very democratic process that involves citizens. So it doesn't leave things to the experts. Again, it's a more, claiming back the authority that we, the citizens, have. So citizens' assemblies are a key aspect of how we might make this transition. Community resilience, building community resilience is another item. I'm going to come back to that in a moment. Wealth taxes, again, Gareth mentioned that. Probably the single most important thing we can do to stop material throughput in our economy is to ration fossil fuels. It is the only certain way of controlling emissions. Trying to control emissions the way we currently are through the ETS by controlling prices is an indirect way, and it's not working. And theoretically it could, but it's not. So the only certain way is really just to ration the fossil fuels themselves. So these are some of the things that are politically feasible, and some of the things that the We All Alliance is attempting to do. There's a whole bunch of other stuff that is probably outside the Overton window at the moment for political acceptance, but are nonetheless important things to work toward, and things that citizens can get involved in and lobby for. Banning substances like forever chemicals and fossil fuels, restricting other kinds of chemicals, especially artificial fertilizers, changing the tax system so we tax resources. That's what is increasingly scarce, so natural resources. Taxing the resources rather than taxing labor, for example. We talked about minimum income to provide people with a security. It would also be extremely helpful to have a cap on income, maximum income. I mean, think about it for a moment. If we are already over-consuming planetary resources and more wealth, financial wealth and money beyond what we need to live comfortably means more destruction of natural resources, why are we allowing this accumulation of financial wealth? Okay, it's only going to add to more destruction. Even big issues like transitioning away from fractional reserve banking and debt-based money system. Our very money system requires increasing growth. We're all locked into it. We cannot get away from it unless those systemic changes are made. Okay, big orders, right? Big task. where do we start? Well, this is a very personal perspective on that. I mean, everyone's going to do what they think is important and within their capacity. But here's some ideas about priorities around building community resilience. And here's why I'll tell you a number of reasons why I think it's really important. Number one, building community resilience means ensuring that basic human needs are met at the community level. You know, when the North Island areas were recently struck by those storms, many of those communities were left to their own devices because civil defense was simply overwhelmed. We couldn't reach them. That's going to become more common. So the more that communities can meet their own basic needs, food, water, shelter, social supports, health services, the more resilient those communities are going to be. So it provides security to do that, to work together to build those things, those networks, builds community, builds those supports. Those are incredibly important in the kinds of uncertain futures we're going to have coming forward. But it also has a political implication, because the more people that do that, the more people who realize the situation we're in and the necessity of focusing on basic human needs, the more likely are politicians to understand that people are ready to accept a different system and to accept more of the paradigmatic changes that are needed. Okay? So there's a vast literature on what are considered basic human needs. These are needs that people had 500 years ago, 1,000 years ago, and will 500 or 1,000 years into the future, no matter what that future is. The same basic universal needs will exist. They transcend space and time. And of course, there's some material needs, food, water, shelter, those basic sort of things. Those are universal. And that's what we need to focus throughput on for everyone, not just for the few. The cartoon that Gareth showed about the food distribution, and as an example, there's great injustice in New Zealand and globally. It's even greater. So focusing whatever material throughput we use in our economy, focusing it on those basic needs is important. But interestingly, the research and data on universal basic needs also includes non-material needs. Things like a sense of identity, whether it's cultural or sexual orientation, or as a scientist or as a farmer or whatever. Just the idea that you have an identity that's recognized in your community and accepted and supported. Okay? Another universal basic need is having a voice in your community about issues that affect your life. Okay? That's something that's always occurred and always will occur. Having enough leisure time, having time for family and friends. And this is where I come back to that little mental game I asked you to play. Because I'll bet that most of you thought of things that involved relationships or accomplishing a really important and difficult task that was worth something to other people as well as yourself. That those kinds of things that give us deep satisfaction, we don't need a lot of material resources for those things. So we can still improve the quality of our lives even though we have less material throughput. And that's part of what degrowth is about. It's about, I don't know about you, but I've been fortunate enough to have some of those experiences, but I would have liked to have had more. And I suspect you would have too. And that's part of what degrowth is about. It's about removing that focus that Gareth talked about continued growth, material accumulation, wealth accumulation, and improving the quality of our lives. Again, we do that together because we're social creatures. You don't do that on your own, you do it in community. Right? That's a big part of what degrowth is about. It's about reducing material throughput, but providing those kinds of social supports within the community so that we have those experiences, and that's what a whole bunch of other research shows is what gives life satisfaction. You know, life satisfaction is different from happiness. Happiness is kind of the brief feeling, you know, that something nice has happened, but it generally fades right away. Whereas the life satisfaction is the deeper, more profound sense of well-being and goodness that is the really valuable stuff. One other point I want to make about resilience is that there's a lot of different versions of resilience. And some people think of resilience in terms of keeping what we have. That's increasing the brittleness of our system. Genuine resilience is about simplifying our systems so that we can ensure that both our material and non-material needs are met with the simplest mechanisms, infrastructure, systems possible. Right? So when you think about community resilience building, think about how to simplify things. One of the groups that is working on this is Degrowth Aotearoa, New Zealand. We're working toward building a program to encourage and support communities to build resilience along these lines. And there's more information about the whole degrowth movement on this website. And if any of you are interested in that kind of project of community resilience building, you can access it through there's not much on there yet because we're still developing it. But if you're interested in participating in that and helping build it, I would encourage you to contact Degrowth or let me know and be happy to participate. Thanks very much.
I think it was 1990, not 1987, it was Māpua Hall budgets. It was my first election campaign in Selwyn, standing against Ruth Richardson, and my campaign slogan was "Get Ruthless." And on the degrowth story, in 2019, Judy and I have been aware of degrowth for a long time, but also we're aware of where our business was and trying to maintain a big machine. And we decided to change from being a 7-day-a-week cafe to being a 1-day-a-week cafe. And actually looking at everything we had and saying, well, actually, we've got enough. And that's how we look at it as an economy of enough. I've got enough clothes probably now to last me the rest of my life. I've got 2 cars that will probably last me the rest of my life. And so actually, I think we could stop by, New Zealand could stop importing internal combustion engines tomorrow, and all of a sudden they'd be precious, and it would last us to 2050. We don't need any more. Nelson is one of the worst. We've got 1,000 cars for every 1,000 people. So that's the sort of material throughput that we're up against, and that's the scale that Jack's talking about. So with that personal little bit from me, who's got any questions? Ollie, first hand. I'll bring the microphone over. So when you're asking a question, please just introduce yourself and remember that we're here to hear the speakers. So frame your question for sure, but keep that short so that I've got time to reply.
Thank you, Steve. Thanks, Gareth. And thank you, Jack. Quick question then. How will we change the system with all necessary speed to avoid total disaster without a revolution? And where will that come from?
Thanks, Jack.
such a hard, complicated one because the revolution is happening. It's climate change, biodiversity collapse. Like very much the pressures and the choice facing us are we going to passively, have this thing collapsing us, or are we going to proactively do something about it? Now, I'm kind of heartened by history. That's my academic background. And the reforms of the 80s we call a revolution. I mean, the major book and documentary is about a revolution. We can have fundamental transformational change in a non-violent way. And what I mean by where I get confidence, there's a wonderful academic research that shows major societal shifts have happened only with a 3.5% population buying into it. You don't need 51% of the population before these big changes happen. And actually the academic literature shows that non-violent systemic changes have been more successful than violent revolutions internationally over the last 120 years. So to my mind, what that shows is it can happen, and the way to have it happen is to have it happen non-violently.
I don't know. But I think that focusing on community resilience building it sort of helps you hedge your bets. Because what you're doing is you're building security around yourself. You're contributing to security building around yourself. And you're also setting an example that can potentially affect the political process. But the big issue, I'm sure we could do that if we had time. The big concern I have is the accelerating rate of disruption that we're doing to ecosystems. And, we're not going to have to trip too many of those into irreversible states before things get really messy. And we just don't know. But saying that, it means it's worth trying. Again, we have the only biosphere. Perhaps, the reason we're here is that we can understand that. We're the only ones that know about the biosphere as far as we know. Maybe that's our purpose, is to be here to protect it.
Thank you both of you for great talks. I was intrigued that you said the economy can be seen of like an operating system. I really like that metaphor. But if the economy is the operating system, then money or fiat currency or debt-based currency, it must surely be the lifeblood of that operating system. And if we have to change fundamentally how a debt-based economy works, can you paint a picture, if you've had thoughts of it, how our future might look like, and how it might impact every single one of us, every single one on this planet? Because how our money can be invested to make more money is itself a growth paradigm that is embedded in our psyche. How will it look, and how can we do it?
Again, I don't know. We've never done this. We've never, to my knowledge, there's no civilization that has moved from a growth paradigm to a non-growth paradigm. So we don't know how to do this. But what we do know is that in order to go to the right direction, we have to reduce our throughput. That's key. The ecological footprint data, which I think is some of the strongest in terms of describing the current situation, indicates that we tipped into unsustainability around 1970. And we had a much smaller global population then, by a large shot. That's, we were consuming at a per capita level that was still sustainable in 1970. So if you think back then or even before then, what life was like, and knowing what we know now we can make things even better in terms of quality of life as opposed to stuff. You know, we have to use our imaginations about how to do this. You know, there's a saying that goes something like, those who lack imagination can't imagine what they lack. You know? So we really have to use our creativity in new ways, not for growth, but use our creativity and our innovation, because we have lots of skills, lots of creativity, but we just need to use it the right way, not to grow the economy, but to reshape the economy and make a paradigm change. So I don't know if that really helps anyone, but it's the best I can do.
Well, I totally agree with Jack, and you know, it's a question of growth of what, where, and for whom. Some people need a lot more material needs, and some people, I think it's 54 helipads on Waiheke Island, private helipads. I mean, surely we've crossed the line when it gets to that point of just too much stuff. But I think the point around sort of financialisation of the monetary system, yeah, it's a really complicated issue, and I think academically and globally this is a conversation more and more people are having. We're stuck on this growth treadmill. And I think, you know, when you look at our environment, we saw the greatest wetland destruction over the late 90s, early 2000s, in colonial times, because of all the financial incentives for the dairy industry. They were trying to grow at 4% a year, which meant a doubling every 16 years of our dairy industry. And they were trying to address, you know, the problems of the day and bringing in income. But one of the messages that are stuck in my mind is today's problems were yesterday's solutions. So this constant growth machine we've built, now we're seeing the costs and the consequences. So I think maybe the most important question globally with the monetary system is that it's totally de-linked from the real world. You know, we see the growth in financial assets, the growth of markets. In the US, they're talking about minting the coin. If anyone's following this, you know, literally minting $1 trillion coin to try and get rid of some of their debt limit things. But the fact is it's totally de-linked from the natural environment. There's no real world linkage with the financial system. So I think that's our great challenge, is to design a financial system that takes into account the real world, that resources are not infinite, despite money ostensibly being infinite. And that's sort of my vision for New Zealand, is one day, you know, the carbon budget will be taken as seriously as the national budget.
Thank you both, Jack and Gareth, for your talk. It's very interesting. My concern with the issue of degrowth is that there are a number of people in our population who already don't have enough. And yes, I take it that you talked about these safety measures for catching people, but really, who is to decide who has enough of what? So you mentioned, Jack, the issue to do with non-material needs. Well, there's a whole culture and psychology of individual communities and the world in that. How the hell are we going to decide who can have what? It's quite complicated. Before Steve takes it away, Gareth, can I ask you also, how do we get the politicians to do what they said they were going to do with regard to climate change?
It's a really good question.
In terms of how to make these decisions, you know, some are a little easier than others. For example, you know, we really probably don't need private jets. You know, less military armature would probably be a good thing. So, you know, we could start with the more obvious things where we would have consensus. And again, I come back to the idea of a citizens' assembly. I mean, it's not for me to say, or a government to say, or a political party, or even a research institute to say. It's for people to say. And that's what a citizens' assembly process is about. It's about bringing people together, giving them all of the information they need about a difficult situation, and seeking consensus. And when you do that, people can reach consensus. So it's a powerful mechanism to deal with some of these complicated issues that we don't have cookbook answers for.
Can I just follow on from Jack as well, because when you just look at modern New Zealand, clearly this current capitalist pro-growth system just isn't delivering. I mean, 100,000 Kiwi kids in grinding poverty, 7% of New Zealand children are going to experience homelessness before they leave home in New Zealand, and all the other sort of ills which are so apparent in our society. So it's clearly not delivering at the moment. So a way I like to think about it was researching the Jeanette Fitzsimons book, because she was a politician very much seen as a true greenie, for want of a better term. She worked with National. She wasn't seen as sort of a socialist, but actually she might have been more socialist than, say, Sue Bradford. And I found a line that she wrote, which was that on a finite world, we're going to have to learn how to share resources fairly. It's the only way we're going to survive. So I kind of see this vision of trying to live on a finite planet actually is quite empowering in a sense of sharing those resources. Because when you've got limits, you have to decide how it's going to be shared. And at the moment, it's sort of might is right and wealth is power, rather than actually addressing needs. On your harder question around politics, though, gosh, I don't know. Everyone might have seen that Nationals pulled out of Māpua Economy. We've got no emissions pricing of our major polluter agriculture, which is 50% of our emissions. It's really hard as a New Zealander, right? Because, especially working for an international organisation now, they think we're this green, sustainable paradise at the bottom of the world. Yet we've got the 6th highest per person emissions in the developed world. Most countries' emissions go backwards. We've seen 1 year of going backwards. And for 20, 30 years now. Again, sorry, to keep the Jeanette Fitzsimons story going, something I learned researching in the book is she started the country's first ever climate campaign in the 80s. By the 1990 election, National and Labour were making bold pledges to cut emissions by 20%, by 30%. No party has ever delivered it. So I don't know what the answer is, and I spent my time in politics banging on the outside of Parliament, then as a politician banging on the inside, and it's just not working. So I just urge all voters, as the election coming in 4 months' time, to really hold politicians' feet to the fire. And I think particularly with National, who has a chance of forming government, the fact is they've walked out of a number of accords at the moment. And I think what voters want to see is actually parties have a bit of a grown-up moment and work together, and where they do make an agreement, to actually stick to it. And sadly, we've wasted the last 5 years trying to find a consensus on agricultural pricing, and now they've just walked out of it and it's totally destroyed. So, if parties are going to work together and try and find a compromise, they've got to stick at it.
If I can make just one other brief comment about it. In terms of dealing with making these decisions, I think part of what has to be considered is redistribution of existing wealth and resources. And that's really hard for us who have spent our lives accumulating things. But the reality is that redistribution within society, ensuring the resources we currently have, and internationally as well. If rich countries simply forgave poor country debt, that would be an enormous benefit to them. So redistribution is a really important topic, but how it's done, choice citizens assembly.
I think you've got a question here.
Hi Gareth, question for Gareth. Probably touched on it a little bit already, but so the difference between green growth and degrowth is obvious to many. If you try to put that to politicians, even the ones that are closer to how we think, the word degrowth still seems to be very toxic. They just don't want to talk about it. So how do you see politicians actually actively talk about degrowth and even getting cross-party buy-in? How do you see that working? Where do you start?
I think degrowth proponents in New Zealand, and probably internationally, would say that the term is a bit provocative and kind of is to shock people, is to grab attention, because they're still trying to get people's attention and find the early adopters. But things are changing really fast, and I think Dan's has grown to about 1,000 members or something, very fast growing. The European Parliament in the last month has hosted a multi-day degrowth conference hosted by Van der Leyen, with formal support by European governments, which is quite phenomenal to have governments. We've seen the Irish president, the French president make statements in support of it recently, so this is something that's growing with a lot of momentum. I'm not aware of any politicians really engaging with it. I know that you might like to look at this, Jack, talked to the Green Party caucus, which I think was wonderful, but I think they're still trying to build awareness of the term and the concept. But again, for many people in this room, it might be a modern term, but these are old ideas. When you look at traditional Māori Tāngata Māori, the idea of a rāhui, not using a place can be seen as degrowth. The Limits to Growth, which was published 50 years ago, again was challenging the sense of infinite growth, the sense of enoughness. So it's sort of an old term packaged in a more provocative new term, but it's definitely getting people's attention.
Yeah, again, it's a really difficult one, but one of the reasons I like to emphasize the reduction in material throughput is because there's science behind it. And it's hard to argue with the science. If you talk about, getting rid of capitalism, that goes down so many rabbit holes. But the science is pretty clear about how much we are in ecological overshoot and what's required. So keeping on the science on the one hand, I think is helpful, and secondly, emphasizing the importance of supports and having the supports in place, because people can relate to that. But what it's going to take, politicians aren't going to just get this because they read a book or talk to somebody. They're going to get it when enough of you tell them that's what you want. So Gareth's point again, take back the power you have.
Can I just add on to that too? Because often green growth and degrowth are presented as opposites. In a debate, there was a famous Oxford debate. There was a recent debate at Victoria University where, it was presented as a debate. And that was quite raucous, that Victoria one, glasses were broken and people were yelling out. But what I sort of noticed is both parties agreed there had to be hard limits at some point. I mean, it's just a truism, you can't have infinite growth on a finite planet. The question is where those limits are and how do we reach them. That's sort of where we're debating. So I think everyone sort of understands this intuitively. Part of the challenge with green growth, however, is that we're seeing now the cost of solar cheaper than fossil fuels. It just doesn't make sense to put a fossil fuel plant anymore, which is wonderful, but it's still not fast enough to get rid of all the existing infrastructure that's there. We see what's called Geelong's paradox in energy, which is the more efficient our appliances become, the more we use them. So we've got wonderful efficiency advances over the last 50 years, but our energy consumption has just increased correspondingly. So these are some of these challenges we've got to grapple within that sort of spectrum between the two.
Steve Chair asks, we've got questions over here as well, Jack. I've seen that one, thank you.
I just want to say
We'll just turn that on.
Kia ora. I just want to say thank you for your talks. They've been very insightful. My name is Grace and I work as a registered nurse with Te Whatu Order. And my question is, do you have any suggestions for individuals such as myself who work in such high waste, high usage, government-run systems, such as the health system, that we can do on an individual level in our communities and in our job as well, everyday jobs?
I wish I had good advice, because I was actually a hospital cleaner for a spell, and I know what you mean. These are like gigantic institutions, and man, the amount of waste was just phenomenal. Can I open it up to anyone else? I mean, there's the trite comments around talking to the manager and proposing, but I wonder if that wouldn't get action. Probably many people have suggested that over the years. Did you ever suggest
I can say something on the substance he's talking about.
Is that right?
I've lived and worked in a lot of countries, also in the medical field. Probably the major problem stems from the developed countries where they promoted their health systems based on different ones than what New Zealand promotes. And a lot of it involves consumerism at a high level. And for example, in the United States, they run their hospitals like hotels, competition. So when I used to sell medical equipment, people would buy new medical equipment because it was perceived as being progressive. It would save their lives. It didn't necessarily do so scientifically. So the questions that are being bandied about here are really quite basic. There's a lot of us around the planet, so you want degrowth, stop breeding. Number two, if you're going to create a country, make sure everybody has a say in it. You know, don't put everything in one city like Oakland. You know, just, it's real simple. That nobody in this room, nobody in this country is going to have any impact on the world. It's a little dinky place. We all came here who were immigrants because we know what's going on. And in the end, it's the big major powers who are pushing economics. I mean, I've got hundreds and thousands of hours of academic theory behind my back. And we talk about Schumacher, we talk about lots of stuff. 50 years ago, I grew up in the United States in something called the Sierra Club, one of the first few people in the country that created the idea of conservation. My parents were charter members. The country's been grappling with this shit for years. And the problem is there's too many people on the planet. End of story. Degrowth, no more humans. And guess what? When we're gone, it'll all come back anyhow.
I'm not sure what this is. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Can I just give you a slightly better answer than I did, Grace? Because it's about fundamentally redesigning. Because what's the purpose of the product? You know, is it designed with waste in mind? You know, has it got those circular principles behind it? You know, obviously our health system's woefully inefficient, and we focus so little on prevention, which means we need all these upstream expensive costs. But I know it's so frustrating when you're sort of in this gigantic machine which is just pumping out waste. So I think we've got to pull all the levers, right? We've got really cheap landfill charges. And so I've been working in the food waste sector for a year recently. I mean, we throw out a quarter of our food, I mean, more than $1 billion of food every year, because we aren't setting the right signals, we aren't getting the right education, we aren't getting the right tools. So we've got to improve and pull all those levers possible to reduce it.
If I understood your question was how to deal with waste in the health system, is that correct?
Yeah, it's more just kind of what we can do as individuals within these big systems as well.
My hearing's but the comment I wanted to make is that that's what you're trying to do. Get other people that you're working with to together go to your superior about the issue and try to engage them to look at it and make some changes. You know, rather than trying to do it on your own. It's always hard for a single individual.
So I'd like to throw a thought experiment at you. The problem's global. The solutions are going to have to be global. So unless we have one dictator saying what we're all going to do, there's going to be ebb and flow of growth and degrowth across the world. So if you were in charge of New Zealand, would you first ban exports, then ban imports, have us muddle through and being self-sufficient, and wall ourselves off from the rest of the world?
The single fastest way of promoting degrowth would be to ration fossil fuels at a decreasing amount over a short period of time. And if a government ever had the courage to do such a thing and provide certainty about what was going to happen, people would adjust. They would know they would have to adjust. That would reduce not only greenhouse gas emissions with certainty, but it would also reduce throughput, because you need energy to do the throughput, and that's what the economy is about. So it allows people to plan. I mean, people have always traded. We always will trade, but probably not at the volume that we do today. So that's why, again, community build resource resilience at a community level provides some sense of security for basic needs, not for all the nice things that we might want, but for at least basic needs, and that keeps us going.
Yeah, I find that quite a dark sort of vision for this future, this vision of sort of fortress New Zealand with these giant walls and separate from the world. And, you know, it's kind of what you were saying, Jack, like, you know, the world was globally quite sustainable in the 70s. You know, that was still an age where people were global citizens, where they could travel and experience other cultures. So, look, I hope it never gets to that extent. When I talk about sort of prosperity and stuff, I really like the word richer. And I don't mean just like richer in money sense or bank accounts or plastic stuff sense. I mean richer in a cultural sense, in a community sense. And, you know, when you talk to experts in hospice, you know, what people talk about at the end of their lives, they don't talk about money or positions or salaries, they talk about connection and community. So, look, I like the idea of a richer New Zealand where people are productive, where they're satisfied in their work, they've got their material needs met. And it's, you know, no one's saying that no country has got rich trading with itself. You know, I still have a vision of, you know, believe in a New Zealand that's open to the world. And in fact, as a food producer, you know, we have an important role to play in the world. So I want us to be deeply engaged. And to square the circle with the climate question before, this is part of the problem, is that you're absolutely right. We need multilateral global solutions to deal with these problems. But when it comes to climate change, for decades, New Zealand government has approached climate change negotiations as if they were trade deals. You know, we try and squeeze out any advantage for New Zealand, all these exemptions, and, you know, we're probably the only country that, you know, has these exemptions for pine forests, which are kind of bad, you know, not great for the environment and not great for rural communities, but it's because we fought so hard to get these exemptions. So I also hope that one day New Zealand could be sort of more of a positive, constructive player on the world stage. You know, that's everything from global tax avoidance to the environment. You know, often we have been on the wrong side of these questions. So economically, I think there's a really good future for New Zealand, that in a world we'll be using less. You know, for the last few decades, our model has been more. So there's a limit to how many cows we can cram in our paddocks. And we've all experienced that. You know, there's a limit to how many tourists we can cram in Fiordland, and we've all experienced that. But there's no limit, right, to culture or ideas. Or when I was in Parliament, I was quite a booster for the IT sector. And New Zealand actually saw the fastest growth of any developed country of the IT sector in the mid-2000s to the mid-2010s. There's no limit to the expert of software or services or computer games or content like that. So I still see that as quite an inspiring and, you know, exciting future.
I just wanted to come back to the issue of population. I think it was mentioned. From a degrowth perspective, if we're looking at the level of throughput as needing to come down to a sustainable level, because what the earth produces in terms of resources and sinks for our waste, it's a fixed amount that's available every year. And we want to learn to live well off what is available on an annual basis. Because what we're doing now is we're eating into the stock that's been accumulated. And that stock that's accumulated is what keeps the biosphere running the way it does. So it's critical not to dig into that natural capital, which is sort of analogous to your savings. You want to live off the interest, right? Same for what nature is producing. So if that amount is fixed, then the number of people determines what's available per capita on a roughly equal fair share basis. So obviously if it's fixed, the more people there are, the smaller everybody's piece of the pie is. So again, the question becomes, what's the right balance between per capita consumption and population? Again, I don't know. No institute knows. No research scientist knows. It's the community who's got to decide what that balance is. So again, Citizens Assembly would be a great mechanism for struggling through a topic like that.
We've got a few minutes yet, and yes, there's a question right in the middle there.
Hi, my name is Stacey. I was wondering, well, because I've been looking around, and I was wondering how you are going to approach young people. younger people, how you're, like what your plan is to approach younger people, because don't want to state the obvious, but I feel like I'm quite young with 47 years around, and I think, our generation should be a part of this, but we're probably all at home hiding behind the TV or computer game. That's all.
Yeah, I hear you as well. But I mean, I just see so many young people doing amazing stuff in our communities. Or, you know, last week I was on a forum with Brad Olsen, the economist, and Sophie Howe, who took the Kapiti Council, who took the government to board over climate change. Sophie Hanford, sorry. You know, an amazing young leader. You know, I spent years when I used to work at Greenpeace, and we worked very hard trying to get people to take care of our climate change and march up the street. Now young people are doing organising on their phone, and they're seeing tens of thousands of people march. Within our global movement for a wellbeing economy, we've got amazing young leaders like Jason Hickel or Kate Rowth, who I think is a roughly similar age to me. You know, there are lots of young people out there, and they sort of know that the system's been broken now. And in fact, it's kind of interesting. You know, I'm a parent now to pre-teens. They're kind of quite dark, you know, they sort of know that the future's a little bit grim, and, you know, we already see young people consciously deciding not to have children. It's been described as current generation as the first generation that will be worse off than their parents. The sort of arc of history where each generation is a little bit better off just isn't true for many people. So I actually do take a lot of inspiration and see a lot of leadership of young people, and while they might not be represented in this room tonight, I think they're in different forums as well. And you know, they're having these conversations in different spaces, like TikTok.
I think as old folks who've overconsumed for too long owe you young folks a lot. And many of us realize that, and we're here to help. But we need your input. We need you to be involved as well, because it's for you and our children and our grandchildren that we care. I mean, it doesn't make a lot of difference to us at this stage of our lives, but we do care.
Sure, so we've probably got time for one more question if anybody is desperate to. We couldn't forget Heather, she's desperate.
Heather only just has a comment going back to hospitals. Hospitals used to reuse their equipment and sterilise it in an autoclave, and every ward had one. Today it's single use and waste, etc.
Kia ora, Heather. My sister works in healthcare and she says exactly the same, just buckets and bags and bags of rubbish, just rip it open and stick it in the bush. So, that's probably, I think, unless anybody else I've missed. Thank you all for your amazing questions. We are going to have supper just through the doors here shortly. A couple of other things that I would like to bring up. Future local matters evenings here coming up. Just one moment while I have my glasses. So there's a few events coming up which people might be interested in. Just I'll run through them. So this coming weekend on Saturday evening, the Climate Forum, Nelson Tasman Climate Forum, James Renwick and Paul White speaking. The doors open at 7 o'clock, and that's at the Green Meadows Centre. So that was a talk that was going to be on about 6 or 8 weeks ago when the storm happened and it was postponed because of the weather. Talking about the same sort of thing, particularly food again. And James is, I don't know Paul White at all, but he's a scientist in Wellington who's got a great deal of knowledge about this situation that we're talking about, and talking about food security particularly. And then on Sunday, just to push the green barrel a little bit, Chloe Swarbrick is talking at the same venue at, I've got the time there somewhere, 2:30 to 3:30, so if anybody wants to be really inspired by a young person, get into Stoke on Sunday afternoon to hear Chloe. She's really inspirational. And then a couple more of the local matters events. So on the Wednesday, the 16th of August, is the Nelson Tasman 2050 group are talking, and that's talking about the way we house ourselves and the future of urbanisation. And then on Wednesday the 13th of September, Steve Abel is coming in. He's a Greenpeace activist, so that will be a different topic again and more about activism. So thank you all very much. Thank you particularly to Jack and to Gareth. Really inspirational, just interesting. I mean, there is no answer, easy answer, like Jack said. It's only, the answers can only come from us, so we've got to step up and say, this is what we want, and take that power. Talk to your friends, become a strong community, grow your own food security, and hold on tight. I would say, because it's going to be having a half or less of our throughput, our current throughput, is quite a challenge.
And make your vote count.
Yeah, and make your vote count. Yeah, so it's just today, the official announcement, I am the Green Party candidate for West Coast Tasman, so I'm pretty excited about that. Yeah, so make sure that you're enrolled and that your young people are enrolled, and take it seriously. Everything we do is political. Money is political. Every time you spend $1, you're making a political act. So yeah, think about that, and what is it worthwhile with what you're spending your money on, and is it profiting the right people if there's profit involved, which there usually is, because that's why we do business. So thank you again, and yeah, come and have a cup of tea, have a chat. If you want to bail these guys up for a bit more of an in-depth, then do that, or each other. There's plenty of people here with lots of experience, so thank you again, and kia ora koutou.